There is a woman in Hamburg, Germany, living in a two-room apartment on a quiet side street that smells of bread from the bakery below. She receives a small state pension. She does not speak to journalists, but wrapped in embroidered cloth inside a wooden chest she carried out of Kabul decades ago is a single photograph. In it stands a woman in silk robes edged in gold thread, attended by servants, standing in a walled garden of pomegranate trees that no longer exists in a city that has been bombed flat and rebuilt and bombed flat again. The woman in the photograph was her great-grandmother. Her great-grandmother was a princess of the Durrani dynasty, the family that built Afghanistan, the family that once commanded an empire stretching from the plains of Sind to the mountain passes of Khorasan, the family whose founder was crowned with a wheat stalk because no crown yet existed for the empire he was about to create. Her great-grandmother never once in her life carried her own water. She never cooked her own food. She never appeared before a man who was not her husband or her father. She was raised in the innermost chambers of a palace complex where the carpets were so thick that footsteps made no sound, and the air in the women's quarters was kept perpetually scented with burning oud wood and dried rosewater. She was educated in Arabic, in Persian poetry, in the management of a household staff that numbered in the dozens. She could recite from the Shahnameh. She could compose verse in Dari. She was trained for a life that was entirely specific, entirely defined, and entirely dependent on the survival of the man at the center of the royal court. And within a single decade, she was sleeping on the floor of a stranger's house in a city that was not her own, nursing a child born in exile, with nothing remaining of her former world except that photograph. A handful of memories she did not speak of to the Italian and German children her own children later went to school alongside, and the absolute unshakable knowledge of who she had been. This is the story of what happened to the women of Afghanistan's Durrani dynasty after their world was destroyed. It is not a story that appears in many textbooks. It is not a story that has been told often in any language other than fragments of Persian and Dari passed between women in exile households across 2 centuries. But it is one of the most complete destruction of a royal family in the history of Central Asia, and it happened so quickly, so thoroughly, and left so little behind that the people it happened to were still trying to comprehend it when their grandchildren were already grown. To understand the fall, you have to understand what was actually lost. In 1747, a 25-year-old cavalry commander named Ahmad Khan was elected by a council of Pashtun tribal leaders at a grand loya jirga near Kandahar. He was crowned with a wheat stalk placed upon his head by a revered holy man because no crown had yet been fashioned for the empire he was about to build. He was given the title Shah and the honorific that would define his legacy, Ahmad Shah Baba, the Father. Within a decade of that wheat stalk coronation, he had conquered Khorasan, the Kashmir Valley, Sindh, Punjab, and the plains beyond Delhi. He marched into the Mughal capital and returned with treasures that left his contemporaries speechless. His cavalry was described by the historians of his era as among the finest in Asia. His treasury filled year by year. He built a capital at Kandahar and later at Kabul. He created a state where there had been tribal confederation, a currency where there had been barter, a court culture where there had been only unending warfare. At its height, the Durrani Empire stretched across nearly 2 million square kilometers. Modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and large portions of eastern Iran and northern India all fell within its boundaries. Kabul sat at the precise hinge of trade routes connecting the subcontinent to Central Asia, Persia, and China. The customs revenues from merchant caravans passing through the mountain passes were extraordinary. The tribute from subjugated regions added more. The court at Kabul during the height of Durrani power was a place of manuscript collections, of poets commissioned directly by the Shah, of jewelers setting rubies and emeralds into sword hilts and turban pins. Court ladies received their own poets. The women's quarters were not silent repositories of passive women waiting for history to pass by. They were institutions with their own hierarchies, their own economies, their own political intelligence networks that ran parallel to and often more efficiently than the official court. The women of the Durrani royal household understood something the men around them sometimes forgot. Empires are fragile. Succession is always a crisis waiting to happen. The mother who positioned her son correctly, who cultivated the right relationships among the tribal chiefs, who ensured that her husband or her son had the loyalty of the right generals at the right moment, that mother was as politically active as any courtier. She simply operated from behind walls of carved wood and embroidered curtains rather than in open durbar. These women knew the empire from the inside. They knew its weaknesses. They understood which alliances were solid and which were purchased. They had no means to prevent what was coming, but they were not ignorant of it. Ahmad Shah Baba died in 1772, leaving an empire and a catastrophic succession problem. His son Timur Shah moved the capital from Kandahar to Kabul and ruled for 21 years, dying in 1793 with 23 sons and no clear arrangement for which of them should follow him. What came next was 4 decades of fracture. Shah Zaman, Shah Mahmud, Shah Shuja, Shah Mahmud again, Shah Shuja again. Each deposition was accompanied by violence. Princes were blinded to remove them from the line of succession, an ancient practice that preserved the victor's claim while technically allowing the defeated to live. Mothers watched their sons imprisoned and maimed. Daughters were dispatched as marriage currency to the households of tribal chiefs whose loyalty needed purchasing. The royal women of the Durrani court spent those 40 years in a state of constant low-grade terror, their positions rising and falling with each change of power, their survival dependent entirely on which faction happened to be dominant in Kabul that particular season. By the time Shah Shuja ul Mulk made his final attempt to hold the throne, the dynasty had been hemorrhaging people, wealth, and coherence for a generation. Shah Shuja himself was no stranger to catastrophe. He had been Shah of Afghanistan from 1803 to 1809 before being deposed by his half-brother, Shah Mahmud. He was captured afterward by Maharaja Ranjit Singh of the Sikh Empire, who pressed from him the surrender of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, one of the largest and most famous diamonds in the world, which had passed into Durrani hands from the Mughal treasury decades earlier. After his release, Shah Shuja settled in Ludhiana in British India as a pensioner of the East India Company. He spent nearly 30 years there. His household, his wives, his daughters, his attendants, all of them adapted to life in a modest compound in a British colonial town, eating from a reduced allowance, receiving visitors who came to pay respects to a deposed king, maintaining the forms of a court that had no territory behind it and no real power behind the forms. Wafa Begum was his chief wife. The accounts that survive of her, mostly in the margins of British political officers' journals and in a handful of Persian-language memoirs from the exile community, describe a woman of extraordinary administrative capability and absolute personal dignity. She had managed the finances of the Ludhiana household through 3 decades of exile with a precision born entirely from necessity. She counted what came in. She accounted for what went out. She made the allowance stretch without complaint because she understood that complaint produced nothing except the impression of weakness. And the impression of weakness was something a woman in her position could not afford. She dressed as befitting her station at all times, which British officers noted with a mixture of respect and genuine puzzlement, because here was a woman in a modest compound in Ludhiana who maintained the bearing of a queen when there was no kingdom left to be queen of. One British officer, writing to a colleague in 1831, described her as more queen in manner than any woman I have encountered in a palace. He meant it as an observation. She would have considered it the minimum acceptable standard. In 1939, the British East India Company decided that their strategic interests in Central Asia required a friendly ruler in Kabul to counter growing Russian influence from the north. The solution they chose was to march an army through the Khyber Pass and restore Shah Shuja to the Afghan throne by force. Wafa Begum and the royal household packed what remained of their Ludhiana life and returned to Kabul. They came back to the Bala Hisar, the ancient fortified citadel above the city that had served as the seat of Durrani power for generations. The Zenana was reopened. The household resumed something resembling its former structure, but everyone within the fort understood the reality beneath the ceremony. The British soldiers stationed around the perimeter were not an honor guard. They were evidence of who was actually in charge. The Afghan chiefs who had not been consulted about this restoration understood that too. They had not invited the British into their country, and they had not asked for Shah Shuja back. The rebellion that followed was not a surprise to anyone paying careful attention. It was a surprise only in the completeness of its success. In 1841, The uprising in Kabul began in earnest. In November, the British political agent Sir William Macnaghten was murdered in a meeting that was supposed to be a negotiation. In January 1842, the entire British garrison of Kabul, 4,500 soldiers and more than 12,000 camp followers, began a catastrophic retreat through the mountain passes in the depths of winter. Afghan fighters attacked from the ridgelines above. The column was destroyed almost completely. Of the entire force, one man, an army surgeon named William Brydon, reached the British garrison at Jalalabad alive. The passes filled with the bodies of soldiers, sepoys, merchants, servants, wives, and children of camp followers, frozen where they fell or killed where they sheltered. It was one of the most complete military destructions in the entire history of British imperial expansion. Inside the Bala Hisar, the women waited. They heard the sounds of the city changing through the fortress walls. They heard fighting in the streets. Information arrived in fragments through servants and attendants who moved between the inner and outer worlds. The British are retreating. The column is under attack. The column is gone. Wazir Akbar Khan, the son of Dost Muhammad Khan, the Barakzai chief who had ruled Kabul before Shah Shuja's British-backed restoration, was in control of the city. And then on April 5, 1842, Shah Shuja ul Mulk was shot and killed near the Bala Hisar by a man named Shuja ud Dawla, almost certainly acting on Akbar Khan's instruction. His body was left on the road. No official messenger came to the Zenana. There was no formal announcement. The women understood from the quality of the silence that fell over the household in the hours after the killing. The cessation of the ordinary sounds of a functioning court is its own sound, once you have spent enough years learning to hear it. Wafa Begum, who had survived 30 years of exile and return and exile again, sat in the Bala Hisar with that silence and understood precisely what it meant. The immediate aftermath was chaos contained within walls. The royal women were technically in the custody of no one and under the protection of no one. Wazir Akbar Khan made a strategic calculation regarding the British hostages he held, the surviving officers' wives and their children. He housed them in a compound near the royal women's quarters for several months in 1842, creating an arrangement that had no parallel in the history of either culture. Afghan princesses and British officers' wives sharing courtyard space and water supply, each group entirely unable to communicate with the other, each group grieving in their own direction, each group waiting for something. The British women were waiting for rescue. The Afghan royal women were waiting for something that had no name because there was no precedent for what had just happened to them. In September 1842, a British punitive expedition under General Pollock retook Kabul and freed the British hostages. There were reunions. There was relief. The British women came home to a world that had a place for them. For the Afghan royal women, there was nothing. No army came in their name. No treaty mentioned them. Dost Muhammad Khan returned from his own period of British custody in 1843 and resumed control of Afghanistan. He was not, by the record of his era, a cruel man toward the women of his defeated rivals. The Pashtun code of honor that governed his conduct placed genuine obligations on the protection of women, even enemy women. He did not imprison or harm them, he simply did not support them, and in their circumstances, the absence of support was its own form of sentence. Wafa Begum spent the years after 1842 doing the only thing available to her: managing, petitioning, maintaining composure as a discipline of survival. She wrote to British authorities in India requesting the resumption of the Ludhiana pension. The British eventually agreed to a small allowance. She accepted it as she had always accepted such things, without visible gratitude and without visible despair, because both were responses she could not afford. She died in the years that followed. The precise date was not recorded by anyone who kept official records. She had been a queen by title twice over and by capability always, and history noted her death by not noting it at all. The daughters of Shah Shuja and of the other Durrani princes who scattered after 1842 faced the particular cruelty of sudden irrelevance. Royal daughters were married to create alliances. Their entire social value was political, entirely dependent on their father's power, meaning something to someone with an army. After 1842, a Durrani daughter carried a lineage that conferred nothing except a connection to a court that no longer existed. Some were absorbed into the households of tribal chiefs and distant relatives who felt some residual obligation. These households were not cruel, but they were not courts. The women living in them had been trained for one specific existence and were living an entirely different one, with no language for the distance between those two lives and no one around them who could help them measure it. A report filed by a British political agent in Peshawar in the 1850s describes a woman arriving at the residency gate and waiting for 3 hours in the street outside. When a junior officer finally came to hear her petition, she was dressed in clothing that had once been silk and was now mended so many times that the original fabric was almost invisible beneath the repairs. She requested 20 rupees. She did not receive it that day. The agent's notation in the margin of the file reads, in English, "Claim unverified, amount not disbursed. There is no subsequent entry." She walked back into the Peshawar street and disappeared from the official record entirely, which was where most of these women disappeared. The women who found their way to Ludhiana, where the exile community from Shah Shuja's earlier period of British dependency had originally gathered, reconstituted a small community in the 1840s as survivors arrived from Kabul. They rented modest houses. They received the British allowance, which was inadequate and paid inconsistently depending on the discretion of whichever political officer oversaw their case that year. Their children grew up knowing Kabul from description rather than memory. Their daughters learned to sew their own clothes because there were no longer servants to do it and because the allowance did not extend to seamstresses. An elderly woman in that Ludhiana community, remembered in the oral tradition of the exile families only by the name Bibi Zarghuna, meaning Golden Lady, was recalled by the next generation for a specific nightly practice. She recited the names of the rooms of the Bala Hisar one by one in the exact order she had known them. The room where she had slept, the garden where the pomegranate trees flowered each spring, the corridor connecting the women's quarters to the prayer chamber, the room where she had first learned to read. She recited these names every evening before sleeping in the way a devout person recites prayers, as a practice, as a preservation of something that no longer existed in any material form. The women of the next generation remembered that she had done this. They could not always remember the names themselves, only the act of naming. The names disappeared. The memory of the naming lasted one generation longer. There were, even within this extended catastrophe, individuals who broke through the abandonment with something human. A Sikh grain merchant in Ludhiana, whose name does not appear in any official document, but who exists in the oral memory of the exile community, took it upon himself at some point in the late 1840s to ensure that the young daughters of a deceased Durrani prince received an education. He hired a tutor and paid for the sessions from his own money. When his family asked why, he said only that the girls were daughters of someone who had mattered and that this was not their fault. He did not frame it as charity. He said he was correcting an imbalance. The girls grew up literate in Dari and Urdu in a household that would otherwise have had no means to give them any formal instruction at all. One of them later taught the women of her husband's congregation to read in a mosque in Lahore decades later, passing forward in one direction something that had been given to her unexpectedly from another. In Peshawar, in the same period, a British officer's wife, whose journal survives in partial form, arranged for regular food deliveries to a household she identified privately as containing women of the former royal family. Her husband's journal notes this arrangement matter-of-factly as something his wife did that he apparently did not question. She left no record of her reasoning. The deliveries continued for some months, possibly longer, because the journal entries become infrequent and then stop. Someone in that household received that food on a regular schedule. Someone's week was changed by it. By the 1880s, the Durrani dynasty as a meaningful entity had dissolved so completely that even the British colonial officials who had interacted with its members for decades began filing their petitions under headings that implied the claimants were historical anomalies rather than living people. The formal Persian court language in which those petitions were written, the elaborate honorifics, the precise legal vocabulary of a sophisticated political culture, sat in the archive folders alongside road construction reports and tax collection disputes. And across dozens of those petitions, the same notation in English appeared in the margins: no action taken. The story did not conclude in the 19th century. It extended forward, carried by a family that maintained the memory of what they had been, regardless of whether the world wanted that memory maintained. When Muhammad Shah, the last king of Afghanistan of the successor Barakzai dynasty, was overthrown in a 1973 coup while receiving medical treatment in Rome, it triggered a new diaspora layered on top of the one that had begun in 1842. The women of his family, his daughters and granddaughters, scattered across Europe and North America while he remained in Rome. They were not begging at anyone's gate. The material circumstances were incomparable to what the Durrani women had endured 130 years earlier. But they carried the identical psychological weight, a royal identity that conferred nothing official, an unverifiable claim to a world that no longer existed, a knowledge of who they were that no institution would confirm and no document would support. Princess Fatima Zahra, a granddaughter of the last king, gave a single interview in the early 2000s that was translated and circulated in Afghan diaspora publications. She described growing up in Rome, speaking Italian in school and Dari at home, knowing the shapes and names of places in Afghanistan she had never been permitted to see. She said the hardest thing was not the material circumstances, it was the explanation. Explaining to Italian schoolchildren what Afghanistan was, where it was, why it mattered. Explaining why she grieved a country she had never lived in. She said, "I carry a map of a place inside me that the world keeps replacing with a different map. Both maps are called Afghanistan. They are not the same country. After 2001, when the Taliban were initially expelled and some version of an Afghan state returned, Zahir Shah came back to Kabul at the age of 87 as a private citizen, not a king. He died there in 2007. Flags were lowered. A state funeral was held. Eulogies were delivered. It was recognition offered too late to restore anything, but offered nonetheless. After August 2021, when the Taliban returned to Kabul, the women who had gone back to rebuild, who had taken positions in ministries and universities and schools, who had spent 20 years constructing something in the rubble of the previous 40 years of war, left again. The pomegranate gardens existed only in the poetry and in the exile memory. But the women who had carried those gardens in their minds left once more and took the memory with them once more to different cities where different children would grow up knowing Afghanistan the same way Bibi Zarguna's grandchildren in Ludhiana had known the Bala Hisar. As names, as rooms that no longer existed, as the content of a nightly recitation that keeps something alive past the point where it should have vanished. Today, descendants of the Durrani dynasty live in Hamburg, in Fremont, in London, in Paris, in Peshawar, in Kabul, in cities whose names Ahmad Shah Baba never heard. Some know precisely who they are. Some know the family history only vaguely, half preserved through the long chain of women who told the stories because no official institution was preserving them. The chain is broken in places. The names of the rooms that Bibi Zarguna recited are gone. The photograph in the wooden chest in Hamburg is fading at the edges. The woman who holds it is in her 70s and has one daughter who lives in Stuttgart and was born in a country that is not Afghanistan and has never visited Kabul and does not know if she ever will. There is no pension from any government for being the descendant of Durrani royalty. There is no designation, no recognition program, no Red Fort moment, no UNESCO plaque that carries their family's name. The Bala Hisar is a military installation. The palaces their ancestors built are rubble or barracks or tourist sites managed by governments that owe them nothing officially and feel they owe them nothing in practice. Ahmad Shah Baba was crowned with a wheat stalk because no crown existed yet for what he was about to become. His great-great-granddaughters waited 3 hours at residency gates to ask foreign officers for 20 rupees and walked away without receiving them. In between the wheat stalk and the gate lies an entire civilization. And at the center of that civilization, in the inner rooms of the Bala Hisar, in the walled gardens of Kandahar, in the exile households of Ludhiana and Peshawar, in the quiet apartments of European cities and American suburbs, were always the women. They held the households together when the armies failed. They recited the names of the rooms so the rooms would not disappear. They wrote petitions in perfect formal Persian to officials who filed them without reading them. They accepted inadequate allowances without visible despair because despair was not a luxury available to them. They taught their daughters the names of places the daughters had never seen. They wrapped photographs in embroidered cloth and carried them across borders in wooden chests and did not speak of them to people who would not understand. This is what survives when everything else is taken. Not the palaces, which are rubble or barracks, not the treasury, which was plundered, not the Koh-i-Noor, which sits now in a British museum behind glass, not the manuscripts or the sword hilts or the jeweled turban pins. What survives is the act of memory. The insistence on knowing who you were even when every institution around you has decided you are no one. The naming of rooms that no longer exist in cities that have been destroyed and rebuilt by women whose names the archive filed without action. The wheat stalk is gone. The empire it crowned lasted 2.5 centuries. The women who carried its memory lasted longer.